Hello and welcome to all of you joining us on Zoom or watching us on the Facebook live feed. This is our first session in our Politics and War seminar series. My name is Ahmed Morsi. I'm a co-founder of the Arab Political Science Network, APSN, and currently a visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Qatar. Titled War and State Deformation, and we have a great group of colleagues who will reflect on this topic and attempt to answer your questions. Before I share more about the partners and introduce our moderator, let me remind everyone that this session is recorded and it will be later uploaded on YouTube on our APSN YouTube page. There's also a simultaneous interpretation to Arabic, and you can find it if you're on Zoom. At the bar below, there is an interpretation sign that you can choose the Arabic channel to listen to the Arabic interpretation. Our colleague Valerie will be doing her best much of this and give you the best of what our colleagues are going to share with us today. This project is called War and Politics in the Middle East and North Africa, and it's a collaboration between APSN, CEDEJ, and the Middle East Studies Program at the American University in Cairo. CEDEJ is a Center for Economic, Legal, Social Science, Social Studies and Documentation, and it's based in Cairo. And APSN, as I mentioned, is the Arab Political Science Network, which basically focuses and aims to support graduate students and faculty members who are engaged in teaching political science and social science across the Arab world. This project is divided into two main components. One is the seminar series that this is the first session of. And it will run once a month, and we will be sharing more information in the chat for everyone to be aware of the next sessions. And there will be an in-person workshop that will take place in Cairo at the end of June, and we will release a call for abstracts next week. So please stay tuned for it if you are a graduate student, faculty member who are interested in these types of questions, themes, and conversations. Please feel free to apply and share it with other colleagues who might be interested. This project particularly stems from a long conversation that a lot of us have had about how do we understand wars, how do we cover them, how we teach about them, especially in light of the past 2 years of ongoing like atrocities, genocide, and other forms of conflict that has been across the region. It's not only in Palestine, but also Lebanon, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, and the list can go into other regions as well. So our attempt here from the first session, which is particularly looking at the Middle East, is to focus mostly about how states are affected by war in the region, how it gets formed, it got formed, it got deformed or changed over time. And I'm sure our moderator, Mayor Rish, is going to lead us with our colleagues into this conversation. Let me briefly introduce May, who will lead the conversation following. May is an associate professor in international relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham. She was assistant professor at Durham University and a research fellow at GIGA, the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. Her research attempts to bring Middle East cases to debates within the IR theory. And her research has been appearing in a lot of internationally renowned journals. If you are interested in foreign policy issues and in IR issues of the Middle East, you should read May's work. She serves in multiple steering committees, including the APSN MENA workshops, the Project in Middle East Political Science, POMEPS, and she's also one of the co-founders of the Arab Political Science Network and served as its first chair. Thank you, May, for doing this, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Ahmed, very much, and thanks to APSN for organizing this series. This is, again, the series on war and state deformation. And throughout the history, war has played a profound role in creating and changing the existing structures in international relations, but also of political authority. And it seems only appropriate that the region is going through such exceptional moment to reflect on essential questions of the state in the Middle East. And even though the state has evolved as an artificial political unit in the first half of the 20th century. It has undergone a lot of challenges, a lot of changes throughout the decades, and it seems that the recent events in the region are bringing new questions and new challenges to the Arab state. We are joined by three fantastic scholars today. Let me start by introducing our first guest is Professor Lisa Anderson. She's a special lecturer, and James T. Shotwell, Professor of International Relations at Columbia University. She served as the president of the American University in Cairo for 5 years. Her scholarly work has included state formation, also democratization and social sciences and academic research, both in the United States and around the world. Among her books, The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, 1830 to 1980, and another book on Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science and Public Policy in the 21st Century. Thank you, Professor Anderson, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, May, and thanks to APSN for inviting me to participate in this inaugural session of what I think is a very important set of questions about the relationship between war and the state in the Middle East. I want to sort of step back for a moment and reflect on why we think there's a relationship at all. For decades now, followers, particularly in comparative politics, but also in international relations, have assumed, to paraphrase Charles Tilly, that the state makes war and the war makes the state, and that there is some kind of intrinsic and important relationship. And I think when Tilly wrote that, and I think when that line of work and perspective developed, there was some justification for it, but I'm not sure any longer that we really know what either of the parts of that equation are, not to say what the relationship is. So let me sort of make that case for a little while. I've been struck by the extent to which, in much, for example, international humanitarian law and the international organizations of the world, that people don't use the term war, they use the term armed conflict. And I've been trying to figure out sort of why that is and what that should be telling us. And I think in some respects, when we say war, we think we know what we mean. And it is an armed conflict that is declared at the outset and ends in an admission of defeat by one of the parties, or perhaps more than one of the parties. But the point is that it has a clarity of beginning and end, and I'm not sure that we've seen any wars like that in the last decades. So I wonder whether the term we use is one that we have a label, and so we're looking for something to hang it on rather than it's actually a descriptive term. So I think one of the things that we ought to be interrogating is what we really mean by war, when is something actually not it may be an armed conflict, but it's not actually a war any longer, and so forth and so on. So that's one set of questions I hope we have a chance over today and then subsequent seminars and discussions to sort of query. Similarly, I actually think we don't have as clear a sense of what a state is as we once thought we did. So just as a war is supposed to have a beginning and an end that's sort of formally recognized in the by the parties at least, states were believed to, again, paraphrase a little bit, but to use Max Weber's definition, to have a clear territory in which the ruler has a monopoly of the legitimate use of force. A lot of the things we now label states don't have any of that. They may have borders, but they don't clearly have a monopoly of force within those borders, and yet, almost as a matter of courtesy, we call them states. So just as I think we ought to be thinking about what we mean by what we're labeling war, I think we ought to try and dig under what we're labeling states. So this, destabilizes the terms of our discussion, but I think we should start with that and then sort of proceed from a set of questions rather than a set of assumptions. A couple of observations about what that might represent in terms of the Middle East and the relationship between conflict and political units, or something more general than war and states, perhaps. One of the things that's really interesting about the post-Second World War era in the world as a whole, and particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, is that wars don't end. They are pursued for a while. There's a ceasefire, there's peacekeeping forces, there's something, but nobody ever declares that they've lost a war. No, there hasn't been a war that was really lost. And interesting, even in some of the most sanguinary wars, like the Iraq-Iran war, it ended status quo ante. It was, nothing happened. And similarly, the Lebanese Civil War, it sort of ended and everybody resumed what was happening before. So there's been a lot of armed conflict, but it's not clear that this armed conflict actually has done any of the kinds of things that we social scientists think war does, because it just pauses and then takes up again. So I think we need to be thinking about what some of the implications of our labeling might be. Nora Lurie has talked about, in a different context, about permanent temporary status. And I think that's one of the things that has sort of characterized a lot of the interstate relations, or what we would call interstate relations, in the Middle East and North Africa. It's temporary, but it lasts forever. And I think one of the reasons why state formation has been as perhaps unexpectedly vexed in the Middle East has been the extent to which the status of Palestinians living both within historic Palestine and in the rest of the region has been this sort of permanent temporary status. And so who is responsible for the populations within these boundaries and so forth has been contested virtually since the beginning of the modern era after the Second World War. So I think these kinds of issues are the sort of issues that we ought to be taking up, and I will leave it there. I have many more observations to make, but I look forward to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, very much. I would also like to invite our audience, if you have any questions to the speakers, please put them in the chat, and we will do our best to go through all the questions during the Q&A session. Our second speaker is Professor Adham Saouli. He's Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies in Qatar, and Professor in International Relations at the University of St. Andrews in the UK. Adham's research focuses on state formation, the international relations of the Middle East, and social movement. Among his books, The Arab State, Dilemmas of Late Formation, and a second book, Hezbollah, Socialization and Its Tragic Ironies. Adham, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, May, very much for this invitation, and thank APSN for inviting me to participate in this very exciting seminar series, and especially this inaugural session. I suppose, like Lisa, I had in mind to start with Charles Tilly's formula, and Lisa has somehow paved the way to do so. Not necessarily because it's a precise or a perfect formula. Indeed, Charles Tilly talked about states, war-made states and states-made war. And he was clear about that because I think he was referring to European experience in state formation. He didn't intend to establish a social science formula. So it's from this window, from this corner, that I believe we could approach the topic. That said, I still believe there is an interesting relationship between war or conflict, understood in its broadest sense of the word, and the attempt to build institutions. And in my understanding, the building of a state is the continuation of war in institutional means. It does mean someone managed to dominate over others and establish some sort of institutions to reproduce its own power. Now, approaching the Middle East, I did face quite a few difficulties in trying to understand the state. What does it mean? Where do you start? So what Lisa has pinpointed at, I think it's very important. What I will suggest is a mere suggestion coming from my book, but is the need to conceptually differentiate conceptually between regime formation and state formation. What we see in the Middle East in the 20th century and the period after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire are conscious and unconscious attempts to build a state. But what that precisely meant is really the building of a regime. And by regime here, I don't mean a political regime in the sense of a political system, be it a monarchy or a republic or democracy, authoritarian system. What I mean by regime is a coalition of forces who manage to dominate over the institutions of the state. And this conceptual difference is quite important to understand the developments of the state in the Middle East. In my understanding, we could all approach them as attempts to build states. Some succeeded to an extent, and others deformed, at least in my understanding of their political development. Now, the conceptual differentiation here is important in other ways, because when we talk about how, for example, a war might have shaped the development of a state, we do need to take into consideration how the regime interacts with its own society, not only with enemies outside of the state. One particular example is Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980. Was this because Saddam Hussein believed the new revolutionary regime constituted an external threat to Iraq as a whole, meaning Iraq as a state, or whether it constituted a threat to his own ruling regime within Iraq? And this is, once again, it makes the differentiation between a regime and the state quite important in this regards. I'm inclined to believe that he felt threatened as a regime of power, and this shaped the choice to go to war, but also it shaped dynamics within Iraq. Of course, there are other examples we could refer to, but the point is these regimes were also in certain moments in a war with other adversaries within the so-called state, the boundaries which the colonial powers have drawn in the region, and which peoples of the region, social movements of the regions, and ultimately regimes and oppositional forces had to deal with, had to adapt to. Again, struggling to find a concept for these boundaries. How do you conceptualize them? I escaped to the concept of social fields. I proposed that colonial powers have drawn certain territories. I called these social fields, in where attempts at state building take place, and where states either form or deform depending on the constitution of this social field. Of course, not perfect answers at all, but it did helped me stay sane for a period as when I was working on this topic. So the building of these regimes continues in the form of authoritarian regimes. Reproducing power becomes a necessity for these regimes, which causes its own conflict with various societal forces. I mean, take the example of Hafiz al-Assad and the Muslim Brotherhood opposition in 1979 or 1980 in Syria. That was, it could be conceptualized as a civil war. It wasn't about the state fighting, quote unquote, terrorists or extra state forces or paramilitary groups. It was actually two segments of societies fighting one another. So it seems to me the factor of conflict and the factor of war, and I agree with Lisa, we do need to be precise in how we define these concepts, continue to play a key influence on regime society relations and regime relations with other regimes in the region. Of course, at a later stage, we might be talking about why did certain regimes deform in the region. And I think it has to do with these attempts to build states that really went wrong in many, especially Republican regimes in the region. I'll stop here so I don't get too excited and keep on going. So I hope that suffices for now.
Thank you, Adham, very much. Just a quick note, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A button, not the chat button. I was reminded just now in the chat. So in the Q&A button, please. So our third speaker is Professor Sean Yom, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University and Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Sean has worked on regime and governance in the Middle East, especially on Arab monarchies like Jordan, Kuwait, and Morocco. He also researched questions of authoritarianism, democratization, and economic development. Among his publications, the book From Resilience to Revolution, How Foreign Interventions Destabilize the Middle East, and another book on government and politics of the Middle East and North Africa. Sean, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, May, and thanks for the Arab Political Science Network for having me and my fellow panelists here this morning. Lisa and Adham already said a great deal of brilliant insights about how we need to better conceptualize the divisions between regimes and states, how we need to rethink fields of war and war making, and they, I think, invoke a really important question about what is meant by notions of conflict and obviously armed conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. What I want to do in the few minutes here that I have is throw another, I think, hopefully provocative point out there, and that I think problematizes how we might want to research more creatively the nexus between wars and states and regimes in the future. And that is a pitch for wanting to throw more attention on not just the actual wars, or not the action of war itself, which is to say not the visceral physical episodes of violence and conflict that constitute what we might consider war in a conventional sense, but rather how regimes mobilize for war and prepare for war also exert devastating and distorting pathologies upon not just their states, but the most basic social and economic institutions and their population. In other words, we don't have to see conflict or violence to witness the consequences of war for entire human populations across the region. And so a case I have in mind, and this is something that I've worked upon intensively over the past few years, is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Jordan has fought no major wars for a half century, not since its Black September civil conflict in 1970 and 1971. it's made peace with its major historical antagonist in Israel, right? And every time Jordan has launched some sort of military strike or defended its borders over the past 20 to 30 years against some sort of external terrorist threat or incursion by a militia group, it's always done so with the full-throated backing of the American war-making machine. And yet this is a state that spends 30 to 40% of its public budget on its coercive apparatus. This is a state where nearly 1 in 6 formally employed men make a living by soldiering, spying, or policing for the Hashemite regime. So to my mind, I think a very provocative question we might ask is not simply what do wars and what do episodes of violence do to states, and how do they distort state functions and state capacity and the relationship between regimes and states, but how do both institutional and performative actions in preparation for war, as if these regimes have to fight wars, how do those affect their governance, their economies, and the human security of their populations? A second and final point, and I'll end after this point, a second point I wanted to raise, and this is something that was invoked in hearing the comments or the references to the immortal Charles Tilly from Lisa and Atham, is when we make dictums like, states make war, wars make states, and we think about that conceptual relationship, I think it's important to historically contextualize where that dictum comes from. It comes from a medieval period of European war making, where the process of mobilizing for war by building armies was profoundly different than it is here in the 21st century. When we think about, for instance, how the Gulf countries, for instance, Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, are building or rebuilding their militaries now, right? That process is not so much predicated upon a human-intensive enterprise in terms of, for instance, mass conscription and mobilizing an army of 500,000 people, right? Their militarization since the Arab uprisings in 2011 and 12 have occurred through a much more sophisticated set of global capitalist networks. The entire Gulf region now, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, has become a lodestar in the global defense industry. If you think about the transnational financial networks, the commercial consumption, the security technologies, the connections between governments and private buyers, all the corruption involved in the global defense industry, a lot of that runs through the Gulf now. And we know this because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have their own indigenous defense industries. They host major global showcases and defense expositions where firms like Boeing and Raytheon come and showcase their goods, and they sell to other militaries. And in addition, in addition to militarizing or enhancing their militarization, these are countries that are increasingly developing their own indigenous defense industries and exporting arms to other global South countries. If you look, for instance, at the SIPRI arms transfer database, look at where the UAE has exported arms from its domestic defense production since 2020. Burkina Faso, Sudan, Kenya, Congo, Chad, Algeria, Pakistan, right? Not exactly countries where we might expect the influx of Gulf-made armaments would create some sort of new domestic peace or end their civil conflicts. And so in thinking about this particular point, how the Gulf has become a critical nexus in the global defense industry, which represents, in my view, a downstream consequence of preparing for war, not even waging war, preparing for war and mobilizing war by these regimes, combined with the experience of some cases in the Arab world like Jordan, I think the point I'd like to leave with is, in addition to more creatively problematizing the boundaries between regimes and states, interrogating what the meaning of our armed conflict might be, and more spatially reorienting ourselves to notions of violence across the entirety of the region, as Atham pleads, I think we should also think about how it's not just the violence that matters, it's how regimes perform that violence, prepare for violence, and reconfigure their states towards the production of violence that I think truly exerts the most devastating consequences on these states and economies. They don't actually have to wage violence to be violent to their societies and economies, would be my concluding point.
Thank you, Sean, very much. Thank you to all the speakers. I have a few questions before opening the Q&A, but actually my questions overlapped with some of the questions that came from the audience. So I will combine them and then we can actually move on to other questions after that. I think the first question is really that many analysts and observers of the region are very quick to attribute many of the current wars or armed conflicts often to the artificial state formation process, often citing the very famous Sykes-Picot agreement. And I really wonder, how do you see history and what is the weight of history in understanding what is going on at the moment in the region, and how does the state have developed so far? And it's more or less the same question by Joe Freeman. Is Sykes-Picot responsible for the status quo of the Middle East or other factors? So I would suggest a different order for responses. Adham, Sean, and then Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, historical factors. Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, definitely. I perceive the drawing of boundaries as a traumatic event, to be honest, on many levels. First, you have a collapse of an empire, and then the peoples of the region, movements of the region, thinkers of the region had to imagine a new political order. Now, in many ways, the drawing of borders and the importation of the notion of the state, because it's both a model in the sense that it's a legal political model that emerged in Europe, but it also was a reality in the sense of drawing the borders of the region. So the initial act was quite a traumatic event, but the process of adapting to it has been equally challenging to the peoples of the region, because now you had to do politics within certain boundaries, confined within certain boundaries, and disciplined by an international system, in the sense of, especially in the period between 1920 and 1945, between two key colonial powers. One is Britain and the second is France. So you had to do politics within these new constraints. Now, of course, you begin to see in the region generally speaking, two forms of responses to this traumatic event. One, adapting to it, and to an extent accepting it, accepting the boundaries. And indeed, for some, they believe the boundaries reflected the aspiration of certain groups, maybe in Egypt, maybe in certain segments of the Lebanese society, or what would become the Lebanese society. But then you do see resistance forces to this traumatic event, in the sense of the Arab nationalist movement. It can be understood as an attempt to overcome these political boundaries. Then you see the Islamist movement trying to restore the caliphate, but also it was a movement that was in opposition to these political boundaries. And it's these forces that ultimately shaped the region, with, of course, the continued presence of international forces. Initially Britain and France, then the US and the Soviet Union, and then the US, and now increasingly Russia, China, and other forces. So in many ways, many of the conflicts that the region has faced has been as a direct attempt, or a direct, outcome of this traumatic event. Adding to that was the establishment of Israel as a state, which of course has its own peculiar form and shape of development, which also added another level of conflict to the region. And I think we continue to live with the consequences of these initial early moments until now. Now, that said, it's not all doom and gloom, to be honest, because the state on another level offered a means to organize the societies of the region. And in this case, the Middle East is not an exception, because also Africa had to deal with the imposition of political boundaries, Central Asia, Latin America, even earlier before the Middle East as such. So in a way, this process of adaptation to the notion of the nation state, or the state, the national state as such, and the realities of it have been quite a very difficult process. I want to just add this final point to understand the level and the challenges that the societies of the region face. And this is something, it happens that we were discussing yesterday with my own students in class. Here, unlike the European experience, which took many centuries, involving the establishment of states, which continued to be contested and challenged, and ultimately the consolidation of states, and then followed by the democratization process. In the Middle East, the pressure has been coming from three various levels. On the one hand, you want to establish some sort of order, and you can just think of Syria at the moment, trying to re-establish a state or a regime of some sort. So you have this pressure, which in itself is quite a challenging process, but you also have to establish a democratic state if you wanted to integrate the various segments of society. So state formation plus democratization have to take place at the same pace and at the same time. And all of this is taking place with international and regional political rivalries. So this is the level of challenges countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya are facing at the moment, and Sudan, I must add. So a very challenging process to build stable states. And yes, we can't isolate the current developments from what happened literally around 100 years ago. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Adham. Sean?
No, thank you, May. So I'm largely in agreement with Adham, and I just wanted to add two additional points as a supplement to his very excellent intervention. One is that I think I and probably most other regional specialists are in consensus that Sykes-Picot had something to do with the nature of authoritarianism, the distorted process of state formation, and the frequency of wars in the Middle East, formally defined conflicts over the past 100 years. I don't think there's any getting around it. I think the key question is, how much explanatory weight does the drawing of artificial boundaries have in the region in singularly explaining the frequency of conflict? And here I'm a bit more conflicted. I think that the imposition of artificial boundaries was neither unique to the Middle East, nor, as we know, to other global South regions. I think one of the pernicious side effects of that imposition is that, as we know, particularly after World War II, once you have a fixed regional system of boundaries in place, changing those boundaries or changing international borders within the region tends to be very bloody and very hard. Think about the creation of South Sudan in 2011. Think about Morocco in the Western Sahara. Think about the Iraqi effort to absorb Kuwait in 1990 during the Gulf War. Think about Palestine for decades now, in particular with the West Bank. And so the stickiness of borders, I think, lends itself, because they're so artificial, lends itself to an inherently increased frequency of conflict. But this is where I want to introduce another point, something that I personally believe is a decisive factor. All Global South regions have had the imposition of artificial boundaries, but I don't think any other Global South region has had this degree of American interventionism in stoking, amplifying, or constraining conflict in systematic ways since the 1980s. If you think about, for instance, another example of a completely artificial boundary dividing a logically united people enforced by global powers and completely the product of geopolitical machinations, go to East Asia and look at the Korean Peninsula, right? What logic is there for dividing North and South Korea along the 38th parallel into two completely different nation states? As we know, that is a product of not just ideological division, but Cold War politics. And yet, why has there been no war in the Korean Peninsula since, right? No new outbreak of hostility in the Korean Peninsula since 1953? Because the United States polices, regulates, and constrains that conflict in a way that prevents hostilities from erupting again. That is a diametrical opposite situation from the Middle East, and in particular from the Arab region. I mean, if you think about a list of major US interventions in the region since the 1980s, it would run pretty long. Think Lebanon in the 1980s, Libya twice, in 86 and 2011 and 12. Iran several times, particularly the battles in the Gulf. A little known fact, the largest naval battle the US has waged since World War II happened in 1988 against the Iranian Navy during the tanker wars. Right? Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq several times. I think the list of military interventionism in the region waged by the United States suggests that for the US, borders are not sacred, and obviously not just the US, its own regional allies and European subordinates as well. For these external agents and regional actors, borders are not sacrosanct. So it's not in the Middle East. They can be transgressed, they can be potentially redrawn, as we see in Palestine today, and they can be crossed or militarized in ways entirely dependent upon external interests. So for me, this is the key variable. It is not the fact that boundaries are artificial. It is how are those boundaries treated by external actors who have the capacity to violate them at will. In other Global South regions, when boundaries were sticky and they were imposed, when global powers respected those boundaries, we generally see a lessening of conflict. In the Middle East, the opposites happened since, I'd say since the 1950s and 60s, but particularly since the 1980s. And that, I think, makes the Arab world so exceptional in a global context.
Thank you very much, Sean. Lisa?
I don't have much to disagree with in what my colleagues have said. I guess I'd just like to remind us all first that Chuck Tilley said that Europe developed in a protected time and space, and therefore the role of the international, whatever it is, was quite different there. So even Tilley knew that we needed to be careful in importing the ideas that he had developed in Europe. And I want to talk a little bit, therefore, about this notion of from what was Europe protected, as it were. And this is sort of an anachronistic way of framing it, but there was no international community. There was no League of Nations or United Nations or anything mechanism like that. And in that respect, I would argue that the boundaries of the Sykes-Picot agreement were really as much a symptom and an instrument of the internationalization of what would become, and Chuck called it the Third World because that's when he was writing, but the Global South. And in that sense, the terms by which individual regimes, movements, peoples, so forth, could claim recognition internationally had been set by saying, you are going to be a member of the United Nations within these borders as this. You can't be anything else. We have dictated the terms of the institutional terms, the geographic terms, so forth and so on, take it or leave it. So obviously people took it, but it did mean that this was not a reflection of what might have been called domestic dynamics by any means, whereas the development of states and war in medieval Europe was presumably a reflection of some kind of whatever would have been understood as domestic dynamics. I think there are a couple of things that this implies that I'd like to sort of bring us back to that both Adham and Sean remarked on. Insofar as these borders are symptoms and instruments of international influence, then that international influence continues, and it shapes the relations between those units and other units within the international system. It also shapes domestic dynamics, and so I would argue, to put Sean's point about Jordan in a slightly different context, the securitization of economic development has been virtually universal. The way you draw resources out of the international system is to claim that your electrical grid has security purposes as opposed to economic purposes. The peacekeeping we've already talked about, but I think that's also both an instrument and a symptom and an instrument. The one thing I want to accent from the old literature on state formation here is, as has often been remarked about the Middle East, none of these governments, are they regimes, are they states, whatever they are, none of the things that are in charge of these recognized units extract taxes domestically. So you also have a completely different dynamic that you're paying for your military apparatus, your police, whatever it is, not through domestic taxation. So, there are myriad implications of that. But clearly the sort of classic state formation is interrupted in that. And I would argue, finally, and this, I guess, goes partly back to remarks of Sean's, that in many respects, perhaps the best way to think about these governments in these units is that they are the mechanism by which an international interests, whether they're a particular country like the United States or some other definition of these interests, ensure domestic security. So they're not military anymore. They don't fight wars with each other. They ensure, security and for private investors, for whoever is going to be coming in. That's the function of these. And they don't any longer represent militaries in a classic sort of defending the nation. Anyway, I'll stop there. There's a lot to be done with that, I think.
Thank you, Lisa, very much. I think you all kind of answered several questions from the audience at the same time, because we had several questions about international interventions, destabilization in the region, but we still have a few questions to go through. We have two questions that I'm gonna combine on the role of non-state actors. The first question is from Ali Hijazi. How has the emergence of hybrid governance structure combining state and non-state actors reshaped the traditional understanding of sovereignty in war-torn MENA states, in particular in the post-uprisings era? And a related question from Sameh Fahmi. The war in Gaza has shown that non-state actors, especially armed militias like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the RSF, I think he meant RSF in Sudan, became more effective than ordinary armies in directing policies and acting like game changers. How will Arab regime respond to such threats? I would give the chance first to Sean and then to Lisa and Adham.
Great. Those are really difficult questions. May, just to pace myself and ourselves, how much more time do we have left?
As much as you want, but I think we will have to wrap up maximum by 2:15.
Okay, so it's not really as much as we want. Okay.
Well, nobody gets what they want in this life, so.
Fair enough. Those are two really good questions. And I see so many other good questions in the Q&A box. So let me just answer the first one with a relatively brief response, and that way we can keep our intellectual juices flowing. So the question about the relationship between armed non-state actors and states, I think, is it's a troubling one, because what I see in the social science, and in particular, both the comparative politics and the international relations literatures, are different cycles of thought. On the one hand, oftentimes non-state actors are posed as the kind of dichotomous other to formal Weberian or Westphalian states. They're seen as competitors to the state. They are seen as would-be states that would displace existing states in the region. And yet, on the other hand, we see frequently armed non-state actors collude with, coexist inside, and become part of states themselves. So my personal thinking on this, I tend to side with the latter point. I think that there are hidden symbioses between perhaps not all, but most armed non-state actors and with formal kind of Westphalian state vessels in the region that we don't appreciate enough, and that we lose sight of when we pose these two analytical actors as the opposites or competitors to each other. And I think a very good example of this was shown in Lebanon over the past few weeks. If we think about the election of Joseph Aoun as president of Lebanon, and how a very weakened Hezbollah essentially okayed or greenlit that decision. I know there are many different theories about how and why Hezbollah's decimated leadership is calculating the way it has within the snake pit of Lebanese politics. But I think one persuasive interpretation that I would subscribe to is that a weakened Hezbollah now needs the Lebanese state to be stronger. And it needs the Lebanese state to be stronger because among the few institutions in Lebanon that are actually credible and function without excessive corruption is the Lebanese military. And at a time, I think, of endemic insecurity and potentially greater encroachment by the Israeli government into Lebanon, I think Hezbollah has made a calculation that Lebanon needs something approaching a functional government and something approaching a functional military so that the same state performance can go on in terms of securing foreign aid. I was going to say American foreign aid, but as we know, all that's cut off for all the two countries now for the next few months. But at least securing more international assistance and providing some semblance of domestic order. So I just bring up that example to illustrate that I think there are hidden connections of symbiosis between non-state actors and state institutions in the region. And those have to be appreciated. And though they can, I think, what they illustrate to conclude on this point is further, not that these two analytical actors, again, are opposed to one another, but that they may be tapping the same underlying political pathology. I mean, both, for the most part, armed non-state actors and most governments and regimes in the region tend to be led by closed circles of elites that often engage in the same abuses of power, whether or not they're leading states or they're outside of states. So they're tapping upon the same practices, but they just occupy different institutional structures as they do that. And that's why I think there are some very rich connections between the two that should be studied more. And I think it would make for a fantastic, for instance, potential PhD thesis for those of you graduate students in the audience.
Thank you, Sean. Lisa?
Thank you. I want to push Sean a little bit further, perhaps. Let us, as a thought experiment, imagine that everything, all of the political actors are non-state actors. Some of these non-state actors actually have access to an apparatus and access to international recognition. That is to say, we call them the government of states. But in fact, they are non-state actors, just like their unrecognized counterparts. And if you started with that, then you could begin to ask questions like, under what circumstances and how do particular non-state actors get access to that apparatus? How and under what circumstances do they win international recognition? What are the kinds of instruments that they have? How do they distinguish themselves from the cacophony of aspirants to that position and so forth? So you look at Libya, for example, and you think to yourself, everybody's a non-state actor. Some of them actually have some control over you know, the national oil company. Some of them have some control over the central bank, so forth and so on. They get, you know, instruments here that are associated with states. But in fact, the smart way to approach this is to say, how was it that the circles around Hafez al-Assad won and ensured that they were the ones of all of the competitors that were recognized when the, you know, the music stopped and everybody said, okay, that's the Syrian government. At what point will the same thing happen in Libya? The music will stop and people will say, that's the Libyan government. So I think non-state actors are actually what we're talking about, and that the state is an instrument for the purposes of the victorious.
Thank you, Lisa. Adam?
Okay, just to follow on what Lisa has just mentioned, I've never been comfortable with the concept of non-state actor, to be honest. It's too state-centric to make any sense, because when you say a non-state actor, this leaves you with the question, what is it? I mean, I think I struggled also in studying Hezbollah. I never used the term non-state actor. I just treated Hezbollah as an armed political movement, as it is, potentially a regime, potentially a movement like the Ba'ath movement, like Hayat al-Tahrir now in Syria, potentially taking an official role if it succeeds in reaching the institution, the public institution of the state, and if it gets recognition to do that. But conceptually, just as I proposed the differentiation between a regime and a state, we should do the same when it comes to armed movements. All regimes are either ruling regimes or potential regimes. So this is at a conceptual level, I do agree. Now, going back to the question on the effectiveness of these movements, it's very hard at this moment to define effectiveness. Basically, in the past two, 3 months, we saw how Hezbollah was, to say the least, as Sean did, was weakened, to say the least. And I would also argue, make the same argument when it comes to Hamas, totally weakened, if you ask me. So question of effectiveness is it opens a very broad debate on the topic. But I would want to point out to a fact that most regimes in the region had parallel militias, always militias ready to protect the regime. Why? Because of the lack of trust in public institutions, usually. So we saw this in Ba'ath Iraq, Ba'ath Syria, and in other parts of the Arab world. Now, there is something specific about Hezbollah and Hamas, because in one case, Hezbollah emerged in a totally collapsed state. Lebanon was in a civil war when Hezbollah emerged in 1982. So it was one among many other armed movements in the country. It continued on the basis of a political principle, which is resistance to Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon in the 90s and later on. This is also true of Hamas, although in the case of Hamas, you can't talk about a state because it doesn't exist. There is this entity that we call Palestine. But like Fatah before it, it was also an armed political movement. Fatah took the form of a regime in the case of the Sultan, or And Fatah also became sort of a state in Gaza after it won the elections in 2007. So here you do see how movements potentially become regimes with a public face, or retreat back to becoming simply an armed political movement. In these two cases, they're very much linked to a struggle against an occupying power. And again, the level of effectiveness is open to both a scholarly and, in my view, also a political debate. But I'll stop here to allow for more questions and discussions on these various topics.
Thank you, Adam, very much. We still have a few questions, and I see Sean has been proactive in answering some of the questions, so thank you for that. We have a couple of questions that we can take together. The first question from Amani Abdurrahman: to what extent globalization, social media disintegrates authoritative states in the MENA region, as shown in the Arab Spring? And I would also combine it with another question from Atif Ahmed. What are your perspectives on the influence of technological innovation, especially in the realm of AI for military purposes, on the dynamics of state and wars? I would invite Lisa, and then Adham, and then Sean.
I'm going to punt on AI. I have no idea what AI is going to mean for any of us, for anything. So very important question, clearly, but not one that I'm equipped to address. I do think that the sort of rise of social media in the last 25 years or so has had several perhaps contradictory effects that we have begun to explore collectively as social scientists, but perhaps not as much as they deserve. One of which is clearly the broadening extension of what Hosni Mubarak called the CNN effect. That is to say, people are watching what you're doing, and so you have to be attentive to that as a government. So I think the extent to which, again, there is no protected time and space anymore. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing, or at least can find out a lot about what everyone else is doing, does to some extent limit the maneuvering room of everyone. So that's one thing that I think is worth keeping in mind. It does mean that there's much more incentive for ceasefires as opposed to ending wars and so forth and so on, because there's a humanitarian element to all of that. I also think, as we have observed repeatedly about the uprisings, not only of 2011 and subsequently in the Middle East, but virtually everywhere in the world, that the social media do lend themselves to creating flash mobs, but do not seem to enhance the capacity for sustained organization. So this does seem to me to be a feature of the, permanent temporary status of some of the conflicts, that people can be brought out for a militia for a little while, and then that doesn't produce a political movement and so forth and so on. So I think there are a number of research directions those kinds of questions can take, and I look forward to reading it.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Adam?
I'll pick up on the question on social media. It's important to put things, in my view, in a comparative and historical perspective. Many revolutions took place in history, the last of which, a major one, was the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And that revolution succeeded in dismantling the existing regime and in establishing a new regime in its place. Now, social media, as we understand it, did not exist in that case. So what does this suggest in analyzing the factor of social media is that we do need to take this factor with really a pinch of salt, I would say, and be very careful on how to analyze that factor in the complex politics, especially of the Middle East. One reason is, I think many would agree that in the past 2 decades, there was a hope and an aspiration that social media would offer new social spaces for people to discuss things democratically, to learn about new ideas, to exchange ideas, to diffusion of new norms, etc., etc. But I don't think this aspiration has been realized. Why? Simply, those who had repressed free speech adapted to the means and opportunities of social media, whether it's regimes, authoritarian regimes, or private businesses, or governments, or and it just takes a glimpse at what Donald Trump talks about on social media, or Elon Musk, for example, and you see where we've come to. So I think it did offer some spaces for those who lacked any space in the Arab world to exchange ideas and potentially to build networks and maybe political movements. There is this opportunity, but we need to always bear in mind that this is a very contested space where regimes also have the ability to infiltrate through their allies in society, and allies and agents, because of course intelligence agencies play a key role in on social media. So we need to be very careful on how to factor the role and the impact of social media on political dynamics in the region.
Thank you, Adham. Sean?
I can take a crack at the AI question. I've been, just because I've been involved in trying to track how much AI is transforming higher education right now, because like probably many of you graded one too many ChatGPT essays. And this is becoming quite, quite a problem in the university sector. So I think one of the striking things about the Gaza war is just how much AI played a role inside the Israeli military. So when we think about AI and warfare, I think many of us tend to go for the easy trope of, like those Terminator movies, like drones and machines being controlled by a masterfully evil computer just attacking people at will. The way that AI has been harnessed in certain battle spaces, like think about the Russia-Ukraine war now, or the Gaza war that the Israeli government litigated, AI is used primarily as an informational processing tool. And right now, its greatest use is in the realm of target selection. So we think about intelligence, like what is intelligence? When we think about intelligence, how do militaries collect intelligence? Again, I think some of our views are often skewed by mainstream films. We think intelligence is some shadowy report that some embedded human spy sends in some encoded memo in a tape recorder that explodes after you hear it. I mean, 99% of intelligence in the modern battle space now is just humdrum data. It's what cars are parked in front of a building on a day. How many times does someone use a cell phone in a given hour? How many times does a delivery truck deliver pizza to an address? What's the weather like? What day of the week is it? Is an organization holding a meeting? It's hundreds and thousands and millions of data points that all go inside these giant AI processing units now, which are staffed by people, but use massive computers utilizing the latest AI software to process all that information for one singular purpose. And this is being done in Ukraine now as well. And the Israeli government did this in Gaza. It's done for the singular purpose of determining where do the drones strike next, right? And so target selection for drones, for Israeli drones and missile strikes from human-piloted warplanes and helicopters in the Gaza conflict was largely done according to AI-based decision-making after analyzing masses and masses of just various types of intelligence, of data, of facts. And the reason why that's troubling to me is because if we think about the credible evidence of war crimes in Gaza, about not just the 44,000 people killed, but the number of times that an airstrike hit a civilian target with baffling justifications by the Israeli military, that we thought there was a terrorist hiding there. We thought that 2 Hamas operatives were hiding in a crowd of 50 people gathering flour from an aid station. If we think, if these decisions are the result of AI processing, because AI has become deeply integrated into this task of target selection for drones and missile strikes now, then that's not very encouraging. That makes me no more optimistic about the future of warfare being more humane or precise or civil, if we could use that term, because AI is doing the hard work behind the scenes, any more so than I think my students can write a better essay if they ask ChatGPT. And so I think AI is going to, I think, and most military, I think researchers would agree on this, because this is happening whether we like it or not. All intelligence agencies and all major global militaries are incorporating AI algorithms, software, processing units, and specialists, credentialed specialists who have taken classes on AI, either in business school or the military academies or in graduate school, into their ranks. It is here, and there's no way to turn back the clock. I think the question is, what is this going to do to the visceral costs of war? Because if Gaza is an example of what happens when a military has access to the latest artificial intelligence technology, promises a relatively clean, brief, civil, and humane conduct of war making, and we get this, I mean, imagine what's going to happen if a country twice as big does this in a territory 4 times the size. I mean, I just don't have the words for that kind of tragedy.
Thank you, Sean, very much for that very dark picture. And I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for these insightful contributions. And I would love to also thank our amazing audience for their contributions, their interactions. Unfortunately, and apologies, we couldn't really go through all the questions, but this has been a great start for the series, and I would like to invite everyone to look out for the coming sessions. I'm sure they will be equally engaging. Thank you all very much, and thank you to APSN, to our interpreter, and to all the APSN staff for organizing this.